Taming the High Cost of College, Episode 68.
You have kids, they grow up, and before you know it, it's time to plan for college.
Where do you start?
How much is it going to cost?
Will you qualify for financial aid?
Should you be looking into scholarships?
When will you be able to retire?
What about student loans?
The list of questions is never ending. The good news is, all the answers are right here. Welcome to the Taming the High Cost of College podcast. Here is your host, certified financial planner, Brad Baldridge.
Hello, and welcome to Taming the High Cost of College. I'm your host, Brad Baldridge. Today we have a great interview with Ty Crandall. He's an expert on credit, and we talk a little bit about how credit impacts your students. So I think parents need to, as does Ty, parents need to teach their children how credit works and why they should care about it. I think a lot of people make mistakes in college or shortly after college with their credit, and they get in over their head with a credit card, or they do something stupid as far as a dispute with a landlord or something along those lines, and they get some stuff on their credit report that they wish wasn't there a few years later when they're trying to buy a house or deal with buying a car or whatever it might be. So I think most students don't really understand how credit works, and it's up to mom and dad to help them out. Now, in the interview, Ty mentions a website, and I will provide a link to it. It goes to the My FICO, which shows a little bit kind of a teaching tool on what is involved with your FICO score and how that works. And they've also discovered, if you're interested in creating or getting a credit card for your student, NerdWallet has a great little tool that helps you figure out what rewards you may receive from a student credit card. So again, I'm not necessarily recommending that you go out and get credit cards for your student, but if you were to get a credit card for your student, there's a lot of great tools out there, NerdWallet being one of many, that help you really understand how to apply for a credit card and which credit cards are more beneficial for you versus what's good for the credit card companies. So those links are available, again, at tamingthehighcostofcollege/68. All right, let's jump into the interview with Ty. All right, today we're sitting down with Ty Crandall. He is a speaker, author, he has a podcast, and he's an expert on credit. So welcome, Ty.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
All right, before we jump into all things credit, let's learn a little bit more about what you do and how you came to do it.
Sure, I'm a serial entrepreneur. I think after I got out of the military many years ago, I've got involved in the financial services space and built a successful mortgage company. And I just had sold a consumer credit company about 5 years back, and now I do a lot of work in the business credit building, the corporate credit, and the business financing space now.
All right, great. So let's talk a little bit about credit, because I think this subject comes up as parents are raising their high school kids into adults, and they start saying, all right, should my student do this or that for credit, or how does this part of college impact our credit? So I think a lot of people really need to understand kind of how it all works. And can you start with just a general overview? I know there's something called a FICO score, and so how does generally your credit file work, and what do the general consumers need to understand?
Well, I'm really glad that you're diving into this, and I really appreciate you taking the time to ask these questions and address this, because one of the frustrating things that we see at the level that I am in the credit space is that people are not taught this at a young age, and that's one of the most important lessons. Is that your audience should be teaching their children about how credit works before they put them out there in the world, because unfortunately, the schools, the high schools, the colleges are not doing it. So we see a lot of people get into trouble early just because they've never received lessons on how this works. So that's the first thing I'll speak to, is that everybody should sit down with their children before they go off to college, because they're going to be exposed to a lot of things that they might not want to be part of, and they might not know much about when it comes to credit. So it's good that they take the time to sit down and address this before they send them off in the world. You're talking to the FICO score. That's a good point. I mean, the FICO score is a good place to start getting an idea of how credit works, because if you understand how the actual credit score works, then you're better equipped to actually control the score. So the FICO score has 5 separate components. And just so everybody knows, when you have a social security number and you go out in the world and obtain credit, that credit is reported in a lot of cases to the credit reporting agencies, which are Experian, TransUnion, and Equifax. They then populate a credit profile that is linked to your name, address, and social security number. And that credit profile basically comprises all of the credit that's been obtained and reported to them. And then you're issued a credit score. Now, there's a lot of different kind of credit scores out there, but the one that's most commonly used and we're exposed to the most is known as the FICO score, actually created by a company named now FICO. So the way the FICO score works is there's 5 different components. The most important aspect of the FICO score is the payment history, and payment history accounts for 35% of the total score. The second most important aspect of FICO is the utilization, the amount that is owed in relation to the limits or original loan amount on that account. So that has to do with basically how much utilization you have or have used. The third largest factor has to do with length of credit history, which is how long you've actually had a credit profile for. And the fourth and fifth, which respectively account for 10% of the total score, is new credit, which has to do with inquiries, and something referred to as credit mix, which has to do with the mix of credit you have, such as a good credit mix with FICO is considered to be 2 to 3 loans, like auto loans, signature loans, 2 to 3 or 1 to 2 mortgages, and 3 consumer credit cards. So that's how the FICO score works. Those 5 components: payment history most, utilization second, length of credit history third, and then new credit and credit mix both being fourth and fifth, respectively.
Okay, so then the FICO score is essentially some sort of formula that they take all the data and crunch it through some sort of system and come up with a number then.
That's right. I mean, the FICO score is really designed to depict the risk of somebody defaulting on a debt within the next 90 days. Or excuse me, let me clarify that. The FICO score by definition reflects somebody's risk of going 90 days late on an account in the next 12 months. So the calculations that they use, of course, are secret. You're not going to know a lot of how those calculations are designed, but that's what it's designed to do. Is this person has this much of a risk of going 90 days late in the next year?
Okay, and so then other lenders and other people are looking at that FICO score to see how creditworthy people are.
That's exactly right. And that will determine whether you are approved or are not approved for new credit. And it'll also determine the rates and terms that you receive on that credit.
Yes. Okay. So now, what else, or is there other things that get into your credit file?
The things I just mentioned are the things that will always calculate into the score. So things like ethnicity, race, age, those type of things, male or female, those type of things don't have any kind of impact on the score. Now, there is some information that's listed in a credit report, such as your name, such as your address, your past employment history. So really, most things you're going to put on a credit application are going to be supplied to the bureaus, and a lot of those things can be accessed on the report, but only the things I mentioned actually are calculated into the score itself.
Okay. So I'm just trying to get a feel for how much stuff these agencies, the whole idea of big brothers watching and they know everything, how realistic is that when it comes to credit reports? I mean, they have your employment history? Do they have your education and where you went to college and some of those things?
It's funny how this changed, because what used to happen was back in the day, Equifax back in the day had a really bad reputation for this. And what they would do is they would literally call your neighbor, ask them, claim to be your uncle. They would get false information about you, about your habits, your sex life, whether you were getting a divorce or not. I mean, no information was off limits. And then they would sell that information to anybody that wanted it. And as we got into the 60s and people started to put this information onto computers, then eventually what happened was the government got involved in the 70s and they created a law called the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And the FCRA now really strictly regulates what credit bureaus and creditors are allowed to do, what information is allowed to be gathered, what information is allowed to be displayed, and that information must meet 3 very specific criteria, which is that it has to be 100% accurate, 100% timely, and it has to be 100% verifiable. So that's now regulated at a level by our government that wasn't the case, 50, 60 years ago. So nowadays, the only thing you really have to worry about is, again, your employment information, your residence. They're gonna put where you live. They're gonna put your residential history, and they're gonna put your employment history on your report. But they're not gonna put things like your education level. They're not gonna put things like your income level, or some of those other things that I mentioned earlier.
Okay, so if I'm a parent now of a high school student who's getting ready to go off to college, they're about to turn 18. I'm assuming that 18 is how old you need to be to kind of
To obtain credit, yes.
take your own credit report at that
Right.
point. And so I remember when I was in college, walking down on campus, you'd walk across this booth and they'd be giving you free towels or free backpacks or whatever it was. And all you had to do was sign up for a credit card. So what's your thought on kids having credit cards? Is that good, bad? Should they do it for credit reasons? Should they not do it for whatever reason?
Well, I'll speak to a couple different points. First of all, what you said is something that every parent needs to sit down and tell their children that this is going to happen. A lot of kids are going to get into credit card problems very early because that's the initial credit that they typically have. So I think that really depends on the parent. I'm very blessed. When I was young and when I was in actually basic training, my father had suggested a vehicle for me that I could, buy, pay for, and then you have access to it when I got out of basic training. So he co-signed for me on a loan, and I think as a parent, that's one of the best things he ever did to help me with my credit history. And I recommend that to your audience because a loan is a great way to start a credit report and score. It gives them a high loan amount, those type of things. So I think a lot of parents now will be buying cars for their children going to college, whether it be new or something that's significantly older. It's good to do a loan and have them co-sign on that with you so they build credit history. And also, I think parents should consider, if they have good credit and good credit cards now, they should consider adding their child as or adding their children as an authorized user on those credit cards, because that will give them history and credit for what's taken place on those credit cards without them actually being able to use the credit cards. And that ties into that 15% of the score, which has to do with length of credit history. So I know this is definitely off of your question, but those are two things I would recommend that parents do, as well as educate them about credit cards. Whether or not to advise them to get credit cards or not, I think secured credit cards are a good way to start, because a secured credit card, you have a limit of what they're going to spend and not beyond that. With regular credit cards, not only nowadays will they get you approved, but once you start using that account and paying the bill, then they're going to keep raising the limit. So in a lot of cases, kids can get into a lot of trouble in college because they might get a $250 limit credit card that within a year goes to $1,000 or $15 limit credit card. And the more they spend, then in a lot of cases, the higher the limit goes. So I think it depends on the actual parent. But my advice is that the only way you can really control or try to help them manage it is to possibly consider a secured card, or let them know that if they're going to go out and apply for regular credit cards, the limits are going to continue to increase and that minimum payment's going to stay small. So it creates a scenario where it's very easy for children to get into trouble.
Okay, so you mentioned secured. So what is a secured credit card versus a regular or?
A regular credit card, if I have a $500 limit, I can a regular credit card, basically, they're giving you a limit of what you can actually spend. So they might say, okay, I'm going to approve you and give you $500 worth of money to spend. A secured credit card is where you give the credit card company $500 and they open that credit card in your name, and all you have is what you gave them to secure the credit card. So you're inevitably paying interest on your own money, but at least there's a cap. They're not going to raise the limit on a secured card. It's okay, you gave us 500, now your limit is 1,000. Your limit's going to be capped at whatever you gave them to open up the card, whatever the money you gave them to secure that actual credit limit. So that's a good way, again, to regulate what they can spend, because you're deciding what the limit is depending on what you put on the card, versus an open-ended card where you might get $500 now, but as you use it, they're going to continue to raise and raise and raise those limits.
Okay, so if you are that college kid and you do get yourself in trouble, how long does it typically take to recover? I mean, let's say you got a credit card, you got in over your head, you owed a couple $1,000s that you didn't have at some point in your college career, so that you just didn't pay for 3 months or 5 months or something like that. And then typically, I think mom or dad might swoop in and bail you out, but the quote unquote, the damage is done. So how long does it take to get undone?
Well, derogatory items are going to remain on a credit report for 7 years unless they move to a stage of public records. Public records can stay on there for 10 years, and then they can renew after 10 years and stay on there for another 10. So if you had a credit card and defaulted and they didn't tell mom and dad and they let it go all the way to the point where the company sent it to the courts and got what's called a default judgment, which often happens. What happens in a lot of cases is people get in trouble and they have a tendency to put their head in the sand and hide. And then they start getting notices. And what the credit card company will do is then possibly send it to their attorney. Their attorney will file a judgment against you for the money owed. And that scares people even more. So they hide even longer. They never do anything about the judgment. And then these companies get what's called a default judgment, which just means, hey, they win by default because you never even showed up to address the actual case. And then at that point, a judgment gets put on the credit report. That's when you really get into trouble. That's when they can garnish wages. That's when they can garnish bank accounts. And that could stay on there for 10 years. So it really depends on the level of trouble they get themselves into. And it's another thing that your audience wants to talk to their kids about is, look, if you get into trouble, let us know. Let us help you before it gets bad. Because the minute they go late on a credit card by more than 30 days, they start doing damage to that credit report, pretty serious damage. And that's going to take at least 7 years to fall off of the credit report naturally. And the worse they let it go, then again, it can escalate into a judgment where it can remain on there for 10 years. And once it's in public records, even when it's paid off, that's going to, indefinitely, or that can indefinitely stay on the credit report if they renew it every 10 years.
Okay. So does it have to completely off? Or, I mean, if you showed 2 or 3 or 4 years of mending your ways, is that?
The derogatory item will remain on there for 7 years. So let's say you have somebody that got a few months behind. They went to the mom and dad and said, look, I'm sorry, this happened, tail between their legs, and mom and dad got involved and paid that off. Well, then they have a 90-day late on their credit report. Their credit scores will drop significantly because, as we talked about, FICO score looks at payment history the greatest, right? 35%. And also, you've got a deeper problem here because if they're in that much trouble, they probably maxed out the credit card. So now you've got 35% of FICO, which is affected because they're not making payments on time. You've got 30% of FICO, which is affected because they're overutilizing that credit card. So you're damaging 65% of the score just based on what you're describing, the scenario you're describing. So they do that. Then what can happen is from the minute those late payments were last reported, that account's going to stay on there for 7 years. It doesn't matter if they've rebuilt credit in between. That derogatory account will remain on that report for 7 years.
Right. And I guess my question is, yes, there's something derogatory, but it's now 4 or 5 years old. Do most other credit cards and so forth, if it gets to be, if you've been good for 5 years, I messed up when I was 20 in college. Now I'm 25. Am I still going to struggle to get a car loan and be able to rent an apartment and all that stuff? Or will some of that become less impactful, I guess?
The FICO score, the credit profile, it really has to do with averages. How are you managing your overall credit? So the good thing is the older a debt gets on the report, the less effect and impact it has to the FICO score. So somebody can definitely rebuild after derogatory items. And the best way to rebuild is to put as much positive credit on the report to understand the FICO score and manage that credit wisely. So for example, revolving credit cards, if you owe more than 30% of your limit, so let's say your limit's $1,000 and you owe more than 300, you are damaging your score. If you owe less than $300 or less than 30% of the limit, you help your score. So if somebody's coming out and rebuilding and getting new credit cards and keeping their balances very low in relation to their limits and getting an auto loan and other things, then that positive is going to have a lot greater impact than that older negative. And so they can rebound. But there's a lot of sources out there that are prime good credit card sources that won't even give you any kind of credit card until you have no negative items on the report. So it's going to affect their ability for the full 7 years to get what they want. They might pay a lower rate. They might be more inclined to get subprime credit card offers than prime credit card offers. They may never be able to get some prime credit cards because of that derogatory account, but they can rebuild. It's just not an easy or fast process to be able to go through.
Okay. And then where else is your credit history and credit scores used? I believe that it's used in things like renting apartments and
Nowadays, on a lot
employment,
of things. Yeah, employer,
insurance.
well, insurance is commonly used. Employment, not so much. I mean, you have to give somebody for somebody to access your credit report for per the Fair Credit Reporting Act. They have to have your permission. The FCRA refers to this as permissible purpose. So somebody has to have your written permission to be able to pull your personal credit report. So you're not going to find employers that are really pulling that credit report, but you will find insurance agents or you will find insurance companies that are pulling the credit report. You will find any kind of company that's issuing credit or any type of loan. Again, if you're going to get a property, whether you're looking for a mortgage or looking to rent property, those are the most common scenarios where somebody's going to look at your personal credit.
Right. So I think, parents can be completely selfish here and maintain their students' good credit so that when their students are 23, 25 and trying to get out there and fly on their own, they're not struggling with bad credit and therefore asking mom and dad to co-sign in order to get an apartment or buy a car. Because if they have good credit, they'll be able to do it on their own.
Brad, there's got to be a delicate balance. And what you said isn't being selfish. It's the way the world should work. I mean, you should educate your children about how credit works. You should just sit down. They should understand how the FICO score works. I mean, it has to be over 90% of our population doesn't even know how the FICO score works. And if you think about it, every bit of interest you pay on a home loan, on a credit card, on a car loan, it's all based on this. So I think every parent should sit down and have a conversation with their children about this is how credit works. Here's how the FICO score works. Here's how owing too much on a credit card can hurt you. You see, this is a third of your score is based on what percentage of credit card your limits you're using, which is why you don't want to max out these credit cards. Have a real conversation with them about if you go late right now, 7 years from now, you're still going to be judged based on that late payment. It's going to affect everything you do. They need to have a real heart-to-heart conversation with their children. And then they take those early steps. They go out, they add them as an authorized user. It won't have any negative impact on the parent's credit whatsoever, but it will really help their child to establish credit. They co-sign for a loan. That might make sense. Or there are even things out there called CD loans where they can go to their bank, they can put some money for their children into a CD, and then they can get a loan against that CD, which again is another good way to be able to help them establish credit. So I think that early on, parents should help educate and then help them build some positive credit. But they also need to make sure that they're involved in communicating with their children about what other credit they're applying for and managing so they can make sure that they don't make mistakes that hurt them for many years to come. And then that way, as you said, when they're getting out of school, when they are in their early 20s, they have an established credit profile and score. It's easier for them to rent where they need to rent. It's easier for them to, excuse me on that, that's my phone. I should have turned that off. It's easier for them to get access to the things they need where the parent won't have to carry them long into their future.
So let's talk a little bit about student loans because I think that might be one way or another avenue. So I guess first of all, just to confirm, I believe student loans, but federal loans as well as private loans, all of that stuff shows up on your credit report?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so there's student loans out there where the payments are deferred until you graduate. So if you have a student loan and it's being deferred, obviously you're not making payments, but that's not going to be a ding because it's part of the agreement. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, deferred payments means you don't have to make the payment until whatever event may come, whether it be the graduation or, within a year of the last time they took classes. So that means, the loan will appear on the credit report, but they won't get any history for payment, nor will, they be expected to make a payment until the actual date comes that per that agreement, they're required to start making payments.
Well, so I guess here's an idea, and I don't know, maybe it's a little too, maybe you'd have to figure this out, but what if we made payments even though we're not required to? So you borrow $3,000, you get that money deferred as a freshman, and you just start sending them $50 a month, not because you have to, but because that's what you choose to do. Would that give you, 4 years through your college years as a positive on-time payment kind of thing?
Sure. I mean, a lot of the arrangements won't permit that to happen. In others that they will, then, you're going to help your score by making payments and having an actual payment history. And the other thing is that you're paying down that balance owed, which helps that utilization. Because even loans, when you first get a loan, your scores will plummet. Whether you, and a lot of your audience might have noticed this, they went out and got a mortgage, they went out and got a car loan, and they look a couple months later and their score's radically lower than it was. And the reason is because again, 30% of the score is utilization. So if you get a loan for 10 grand and you owe 10 grand, that hurts that utilization aspect of the score. So they're helping that aspect too, because they might have, 50,000 owed, and as they're paying it down and that balance gets lower, then that actually helps improve their score as well beyond just making the payment history.
Okay. So and I've occasionally had parents say, well, we're going to do a little bit of student loans just to build credit. So I guess the way to leverage that strategy would be to make monthly payments. So you'd have a couple of years of history of making payments, whether they're required or not, potentially.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, some of the things we talked about, I think, are better ideas than using student loans to build credit. I think an auto loan, I think authorized users on credit cards, I think CD loans are other additional options other than feeling compelled to obtain a student loan. Student loans are tough because I'll tell you, a lot of them are government issued. And, you default on a student loan, you can't get a government loan. You can't get for example, an FHA mortgage if you've ever defaulted on a student loan. So you've got to be really careful because with those coming from the government, if you ever were to default, then you really are not able to get any other kind of government financing. In many cases, at least until that's rectified. So just something to keep in mind as they're making that decision.
Right. All right. I think that covers some of my questions. Is there anything else you want to add? I mean, if you are, and maybe you are, I guess I didn't ask, but if you've got a high school kid or a kid in college, is there anything else that you'd like to add as far as what people should do or not do to kind of maintain credit?
I think it's essential that parents know that these kids, as crazy as this is, will not get this education in school. They will not. They're not going to be taught. They're not going to get education on credit. The education has to come from the parents. So that's the most important thing that I want your listeners to walk away from this call knowing is that, look, if you don't educate them, nobody will. And unfortunately, that means that a lot of people are going to learn the hard way. You've got people that are natural savers. You've got people that are just naturally, their personalities are more inclined for them to be spenders. So you might not know which your child is. You might know that. But regardless, all of them, they deserve to have you sit down and say, look, you can go online, you can pull up a model of the FICO score, you explain to them this is how this works. They need to know the damage that's caused by negative items. They need to know to be open with the parent if they do get in trouble early on, because the earlier on they tell the parent that there's an issue, the less damage that could be done. I think that education is what is absolutely most crucial above all else. And the other thing to keep in mind that's completely off topic is that, hey, look, nowadays in colleges, a lot of these students are starting businesses. Heck, now they're doing it in grade school. So that's another avenue is, if your child is looking at even starting a business and they're starting an endeavor even in school, then there's business credit that can be built for that business's EIN that can actually help them get financing to start the business and can even help them have established credit for their business before they graduate. So that's something else to keep in the back of their mind if they're ever hearing their child have an interest in running or starting a business or taking steps in high school or college to actually do that. So that's some of my best advice beyond the fact of help them get established. Authorized user accounts, if you have good credit, that's not going to impact you at all. It's a great way to help them, as well as some of these other things we talked about with student loans, CD loans, that can also, even co-signing on a vehicle, that can also help them get started. Help them get started on the right foot with positive credit is so valuable to the rest of their life. And like I said, I can tell you that, my dad did that for me, and I still sit here and can't tell you how appreciative I am, even though I didn't understand the value then, but I do now, and it really will stay with me the rest of my life.
All right. I guess before I let you go, if people want to learn more about your books or anything else that you've got going on, how can people track you down or social media? How can we get a hold of you?
Sure. Well, they can go to either one of our websites. Our company website is creditsuite.com. That's creditsuite, SUITE.com. And my actual personal website is tycrandall.com. So that's Ty, which is TY. My last name is Crandall, CRANDALL.com. So if there's anything I can ever do, if they have any other trailing questions, they can feel free to get in touch with me for my contact information on both sites.
All right. And you also have a podcast out there?
Yes, I do. The Business Credit and Financial Show, where we focus a lot on finances, business credit, and more entrepreneur type topics. So they can feel free to check us out on iTunes, or the link to our actual iTunes channel is on the bottom of our creditsuite.com website.
All right. Well, great. I appreciate your time. I learned a lot, and I think our listeners have too. So we will talk to you soon.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Brad, for having me. I had a great time.
All right. Thank you. All right, that was a great interview with Ty. Hopefully you learned a little bit about credit and are going to go out and take some action and help your students where you can. Again, the MyFICO information is available in our show notes at tamingthehighcostofcollege/68. And we also have a link to the NerdWallet comparison tool that helps you choose credit cards for students. Again, realize that a lot of these credit card companies out there that are providing information on the internet are collecting commissions if you open accounts. So be sure to verify their information and take what they're providing with a grain of salt, and realize that they're in it to sell you a credit card and collect a commission. However, a lot of them are still useful in that they help you compare cards quickly, and although they receive the commission, you still receive a good card in return. All right, that's all we have for today. I appreciate you being out there and listening. If you give us a review at Amazon or wherever you're listening, that would be great. That's all we have this week. We'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Taming the High Cost of College podcast. Now it's time for you to take action. Head to tamingthehighcostofcollege.com for show notes, bonus content, and to leave feedback for Brad. The next step on your college journey starts now.
Brad Baldridge is a registered representative of Cambridge Investment Research and an investment advisor representative of Cambridge Investment Research Advisors, a registered investment advisor. Securities are offered through Cambridge Investment Research Incorporated, a broker-dealer and member of FINRA and SIPC. Brad owns two companies, Baldridge Wealth Management and Baldridge College Solutions. The Baldridge companies are not affiliated with Cambridge Investment Research.